All right, so today we're talking about Impressionism, the now blockbuster movement that started out as a kind of underdog. So our bracket date is roughly 1860 to 1900. These are just sort of generalized dates of when Impressionism was sort of most prominent. It sort of continues, let's say, after 1900, but has its sort of heyday in the mid to late 19th century. All right, so let's look at the historical context. When we're talking about the difference between realism and impressionism, there's some kind of blurry lines, right? It's hard to define the boundaries between those two movements. And some artists that we are talk about today, like Manet and Degas and even Cassatt, I might say, could be argued sort of for either side, right? And your book actually puts some of Manet's paintings, I think, in the realist section and some of them in the impressionist section. So, let's just say we're going to call them impressionists for the sake of clarity. And again, the impressionists aren't so radically different from the realists, right? They continue Baudelaire's call for art to be of its own time, right? That in Impressionism, you never see paintings of, ancient stuff or medieval stuff or times or places that aren't immediately in front of the artist, right? That they really focus on this sense of direct observation. They focus on the sense of painting the life around them. They also try to capture this fleeting transitory moment, right? Something that they feel, this sort of vision that they feel is kind of more truthful to life and truthful to modernity, certainly, which is the sense of the glance, right? That unlike, for example, these sort of Dutch still lifes where you're expected to sort of look and look and look and look and see all of the different little things. To some degree, the Impressionists are saying, well, no, that's very infrequently how we look at things. We usually look as a glance, right, as a sort of fleeting moment. And so they're trying to capture that sense of vision that they see as kind of modern. But like realism, they also flaunt the Academy's rules of finish and polish, right? That they too, like Courbet, have loose brushwork, flattened spaces, less modeling of color and form. So all of these things are just sort of increasing in degree, let's say, and are similar to realism, right? I guess for me, one of the key differences between French realism and French impressionism specifically is this tie to the revolutions, right? That the impressionists tend to not be as interested in, they aren't personally involved in politics very frequently. They tend to be more observers of sort of societal phenomena that might be related to class stuff, but they're not sort of trying to expose it quite as much. Another part of this idea of the development of modernism in painting is something that comes from much later, in the 1960s, this American art critic named Clement Greenberg. And he, to some degree, has helped shape our vision of what modern painting and modern art is. So I brought in this quote for you because I think it kind of highlights one of his main ideas. He says, "The essence of modernism lies in the use of the characteristic methods of a discipline to criticize the discipline itself, not in order to subvert it, but to entrench it more firmly in its area of competence. Realistic, illusionistic art had dissembled the medium, using art to conceal art. Modernism used art to call attention to art. The limitations that constitute the medium of painting, the flat surface, the shape of the support, the properties of pigment, were treated by the old masters as negative factors that could be acknowledged only implicitly or indirectly. Modernist painting has come to regard these same limitations as positive factors that are to be acknowledged openly." So what Greenberg is saying here is that these qualities of what is a painting, right? It's essentially a two-dimensional surface. It's essentially this, square or rectangle. It's essentially pigment on canvas or on whatever. But these are the things that modernism calls attention to, right? And we kind of talked about this already, this sense that, modernists are saying this is a painting, right? It's not a window like the Renaissance, like the old masters of the Renaissance would argue, a painting is a window. It should be pristine so that you could look through the surface as if looking through a window. But modernists tend to call attention to the surface of the canvas by having looser, rougher brushwork, visible brushwork often, that highlights the fact that this is in fact a painting, right, and not a window. And so that's essentially what he's saying there is one of the kind of primary qualities of what constitutes modernism as a whole. I also wanted to give you a little bit of background of the situation of women in 19th century France. And that's because this societal kind of social historical context really shapes, first of all, how we understand a lot of the paintings of the Impressionists, and also what some of the female Impressionist painters can and can't paint. So, basically, a lot of the male Impressionists painted parts of the Parisian nightlife that would have excluded women of middle or upper class status, right? And that's because, quote unquote, respectable women of this period were so segregated into the sort of private sphere, into the domestic sphere of the home, that they couldn't work. Middle class, upper class women were not permitted to work, or were really looked down upon for working. And they couldn't even really go out in public without a chaperone, right? And there's very few exceptions to this. And the exceptions are typically going to the theater, going to visit other female friends, or going to the park, right, to have a walk. And this was all true, especially at night, right? That if you went out at night, really even chaperoned, you would have your virtue questioned, right? It would be a thing, right? It would be a thing if you went out. So this is because men, upper class, middle upper class men, bourgeois men, saw going out in public as a refuge from both work and home life, right? And they wanted to protect that. And who are they going out with? Sometimes each other, sure, but in fact, more typically, they're going out to see their mistresses or prostitutes, right? This is sort of a widespread phenomenon. And so, of course, they don't allow their wives to come, so they set up a system where it's socially constructed to be disgraceful to be seen in public, because who are the women who are out at night? They're mistresses or prostitutes, or, the poor, which was not, they were not sort of included in this social system. And so this becomes kind of the setup of what spaces can be seen as sort of female-centric or male-centric, right? And it's these male-centric spaces, like the bars and cafes and backstage at the theater, that we're seen particularly in the works of people like Manet and Degas, right, the male Impressionists, who were concerned with representing their vision of a sense of modernity. And to many of these male artists, this commercial or capitalist, right, exchange of sex for money between the bourgeois men, right, the upper class men, and typically proletariat or working class poor women, was one of the key social constructs of modernity, of modern times. And so they often kind of look to that in their paintings and sort of replicate that. And we'll see how this plays out over the course of the unit. Okay, so one of these paintings is by Edward Manet, and this is his Olympia from 1863. And it's, you know, a fairly large canvas, not huge, but, you know, it's 4 feet by 6 feet. It's not tiny. Manet comes from a well-to-do family, right? He's not an activist like Courbet. And he's this bridge between realism and Impressionism. He's seen as kind of a father of Impressionism, but never actually exhibited with them in their separate exhibitions, right? And we'll talk about those later. Because he still wanted to gain this official recognition in the traditional salon, right? He still wants to be part of this system. And one of the things that he does to sort of try to stay within the system is to reinterpret traditional subject matter in new ways, right? And ways that try to kind of make it modern. So this is one of the things that he does, right? This is his Olympia, and he's kind of doing an update of the female nude. And of course, who is he looking to kind of appropriate that image, or who is he copying? Titian, right? Of course it's Titian. And his composition is very, very similar to Titian's, right? So he's referencing these kind of traditional subjects like the female nude and Titian specifically. So they're both sort of reclining on a bed in the foreground. They both have this sort of green cloth behind them. Unlike Titian's little puppy in the corner, Manet has a black cat. And unlike the sort of white servants who are picking out dresses for the Venus to wear, here we see in the Manet an African servant who's bringing flowers, right? So these are some of the differences in the general sort of composition, but there's also differences in the way he painted it, right? So as you can see in the Titian, and we talked about extensively, the masterful use of chiaroscuro, right? This sort of very careful shading from light to dark to give a sense of three-dimensional volume and an almost touchable flesh, right? And that's missing to a large degree from the Manet. She's much more flatly and loosely painted, so that she looks almost like a cartoon or sticker in comparison to the Titian, right? And a lot of the critics really kind of objected to it. So I put up this quote by a critic that says, that calls her a courtesan with dirty hands and wrinkled feet. Her body has the livid tint of a cadaver displayed in the morgue. Her outlines are drawn in charcoal, and her greenish, bloodshot eyes appear to be provoking the public. Right? And that's not a particularly good review. And in fact, this is, at the Salon Review. This is the Salon of 1865. Out of 87 reviews of that Salon, 72 make reference to Manet's Olympia. So one out of what is probably about 4,000 paintings at the Salon receives the vast majority of the attention, right? So it created the same kind of furor that Courbet's Stonebreakers did. So you get a sense of how controversial this painting was. And the thing is, why is it so controversial, right? He's basically doing Titian over again. It looks very similar. Why is this one not okay? Yeah? And if we look at this other painting, this is a painting by Bouguereau, who is a sort of a member of the Academy. He paints the nymphs and satyrs. This is 10 years later. This painting was hailed as, a great painting, whereas Manet's Olympia is derided as a terrible painting, right? But there's lots of naked people all around that one. So why is that one okay? Well, here we have nymphs and satyr, right? They are, first of all, they have this kind of veil of mythology, right? So it's okay if it's not a real person, if it's sort of mythological. And it's also painted with the kind of finish, right, that is expected of salon painting. So the way that it's painted also makes it okay. But Manet's painting is not, right? And this is because she is not just not given the veil of, oh, she's a Venus or whatever. No, she's given the name of Olympia. And at that time, Olympia was a common professional name for prostitutes, right? It's hard to think of, a comparison. Sort of what's like a typical stripper name, like Candy or something, right? That it was kind of, everyone knows that that's what she is. She's this working class prostitute. And not only is she kind of clearly understood to be a regular prostitute, she's recognizable as a specific prostitute. Her name is Victorine Morand. She's Manet's favorite model. And by the way, most artist models were usually actually their day jobs were prostitutes because, most respectable women of this period would not take their clothes off for artists. And, she's given this sort of black choker, this, orchid in her hair, the slippers, right? All of this kind of suggests prostitute in this way. And to add to that, right, to add to this sense of, an illicit person, we saw that that Manet changed the dog to a cat, right? So while dogs are signifying fidelity, right, and loyalty, cats are referred to in Baudelaire's poems as either nocturnal or lacking fidelity or even predatory, right? And so they have this kind of different connotations. And then changing to the African maid, right, is also really significant. And that's because we talked about briefly, I think already, this sense of how in kind of social Darwinism, different races were seen as having kind of different characteristics, right? And so in the extremely sexist and extremely racist minds of a lot of 19th century European peoples, Black women specifically were believed to be actually like hypersexual, right? That they would have this sort of animal-like sexuality. And obviously that's not true. That's just this sort of sexist and racist belief of these people. But nevertheless, that's what they associate with these women. And so by having her there as the sort of servant, it just sort of further suggests a kind of deviant sexuality, right, that is presented here. And it's disrupting, right, because, okay, so we all know that there are prostitutes, prevalent in French society at this period, but no one wants to acknowledge it, certainly not to their wives, right? And here's the thing, who do you go to the salon with? You don't go with your mistress, you go with your wife, right? And so if you're there with your wife, you're confronted with the sort of facts of society, right? This very uncomfortable facts of society. And respectable women aren't really supposed to know about such things, right? And perhaps this one is one that you frequent because it's a recognizable one. So, it creates this awkward tension, and I think created a lot of that furor about, controversy about the painting. She also Manet also replicates the Titian painting by having her gesture be very similar to the gesture of the Titian, right? So that her hand is placed over her genitals, but instead of possibly pleasuring herself, she is sort of seen as being more aggressively covering herself, right? That her hand is sort of splayed across it rather than sort of touching her genitals. And again, this compositional line of the wall sort of goes bam, straight there, right? That vertical line that draws our eyes right to her private area. So all of this, is kind of highlighting for us to some degree what's really going on in the Titian, but also, kind of pointing out these social mores that no one wants to really be confronted with, right? So that's why it's controversial. Another thing that the Manet painting does is bring up this issue of the gaze, right? The male gaze. Because she's looking out at the viewer, right, at the artist slash viewer. And the African maid is bringing her flowers, right? So in the story of the painting, if we're standing in front of the painting, who are we, right? We're presumably the person who has brought her flowers and who she is acknowledging as having just walked in, right? And so that makes us, the viewer, one of her clients, right? And presumably one of her male clients. And so it creates that situation, as we view the painting, this is the role that we've been placed in. So let's talk a little bit about how that works, right? And some of the kind of sexual politics around that. So these are theoretical kind of ideas that are developed in the 1970s, right, with generally the feminist movement. But they're ones that you can sort of, even though the language of it is something that we use today, right, and that is developed much later, the concept of it or the actual sort of experience of it certainly is true for that period. But we're going to use the language that we have for it. Okay. So the concept of the male gaze is this idea that the act of looking is one of power, right? And so I brought in, and it's broken up into subject and object based on kind of linguistic theory and the basic construct of what sentences are, right? So if you look at the sentence, he looks at her, the subject of the sentence, if you remember from like 7th grade grammar, is he, right? Looks is the verb of the sentence, it's the action. And then the subject does the action to the object, which is at her, right? And so the woman, is the object of the sentence, right? So the subject is the active doer of the verb, and the object is the passive receiver of the verb, or receiver of the action. And this is broken down as something that is the subject is the powerful one because they are the one actively doing, and the object is powerless because they are sort of receiving, right? They don't have any agency of their own in this construct. Now, the subject is often gendered male, and the object is often gendered female, largely due to the confluence of the idea with intercourse, right? So male being active and doing the action, female being passive, receiving the action, right? So in terms of intercourse, that's why it's gendered male and female. In terms of what we're talking about, the subject, the person doing the action, is the artist or the viewer, right? They're the one looking at the often female nude, right? The object of the painting. And so in that way, the artist is the painter, right, doing the verb, versus the object, which is the paintee, the one being painted, being represented. And so in a bunch of Manet's paintings and several of the other ones that we're going to be talking about today, this dynamic gets kind of replicated over and over again, right? So similar to the Olympia, we see here Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère. We see a woman who is a barmaid working the bar, and that means that she is of the working classes, right? She would be proletariat because, again, middle and upper class women are not allowed to work and are not allowed to be out, right? So this is clearly in the evening. She's working the bar. There's the implied suggestion that she may be open to an illicit relationship of some kind. So she stands here at the bar. There's lots of bottles and fruit and whatever in front of her. But behind her is a mirror, right? You can see the gold edge of the mirror right around, the level of her wrists. And reflected in the mirror is the club, the club behind her. This is a popular music hall and bar. Again, a space that respectable women would not visit. And we see that in the kind of awkward angling of the mirror, her back, right? We see her hair, her, top etc. And then if we look all the way to the right, we see that reflected also in the mirror is a man, right, with a top hat, right, signifying that he is of middle class. And so presumably that's who she's looking at. But if we're standing in front of the painting, who are we? We must be that man, right? Because of how the viewing dynamics of the painting work. So again, the viewer of the painting is assumed to be male to some degree, right? Because as the viewer, you are actively looking, and she is the object. She is passively receiving your gaze. And so, again, we don't know if he's simply ordering a drink or if he's propositioning her. Her face doesn't really give a lot of clues, right? She's sort of aloof and emotionless. But it's in this kind of construct, right? In this kind of exchange or interchange between bourgeois men and proletariat women that Manet finds a sense of modernity. And also in the sense of the fleeting encounter, right? The superficial contact that leaves no lasting impression, that is also a sign of modernity. So these are all of these kind of dynamics that are developed in these paintings. Another sense of the viewer as kind of being this active looker, often in a kind of underhanded way, is seen in a lot of Degas' paintings as well. This is The Rehearsal. It's a relatively small painting, about 2 feet by a little under 3 feet. And Degas is the eldest son of a Parisian banking family. So again, he personally is of the sort of upper middle class. And he's also seen as this kind of bridge between realism and Impressionism, but he does exhibit with the Impressionists later on. He's described as this kind of realist observer and a really good draftsman, right, that he's good at drawing. And he often conceives of his work and presents it serially, meaning that he paints similar subjects over and over and over again, right? So, of course, he's famous for his series of dancers, painted at the Paris Opera and the ballet school there. And as we talked about before when we were talking about the Paris Opera as a building, we talked about how in the back there in the rehearsal room, during the early period there, basically bourgeois men could sort of view the rehearsals, often secretly, and kind of pick out dancers. Because dancers, again, were working class women who might be open to prostitution or to be a mistress at some point. And so to some degree, Degas replicates this voyeuristic gaze of bourgeois men who observe the dancer's practice, right? And so we kind of take on that gaze as viewers ourselves. And so he does a bunch of these, has these compositional devices to try to provide this sense of the behind the scenes or the sort of secret look, right? And he's famous for presenting his dancers, usually in rehearsal or kind of backstage, as, not in their, professional roles as dancers, sort of out on the stage, but here we see them kind of ungainly, right? So on the right, we see, a costume mistress kind of adjusting costumes. Next to her, this dancer who has sort of this green shirt on over her costume is sitting in a relatively unladylike position, presumably waiting her turn. We see kind of dancers in the background with the ballet teacher, all of whom, are kind of focused on him. Nobody's really looking at us, right? So there's a sense that we're peeking in on their rehearsal. He also creates that sense by cropping the image really carefully, right? So the right hand is cropped sort of right through one of the dancers. The left hand has this spiral staircase. We see 2 legs of a figure coming down. It's almost like we're, again, kind of getting this transitory moment, this glance, right? Not a composed image that's like presented to us, but this kind of behind the scenes glance. And that is kind of part of what he does, right, to create that sense of, the secret looking. And again, he does this in series, right? There are probably, hundreds of paintings of the dancers, sometimes on the stage, sometimes from backstage or beside, in the rehearsal space. Here we see in the right lower corner the staircase again, all of which has this sense of us looking in. Another thing that Degas is influenced by is what we call Japanism, right? And it's basically defined as an interest in everything Japanese. That comes from the 1850s when Commodore Matthew Perry and the American Naval Forces make contact with Japan and start trading with the Japanese. And so it's through this trade that Westerners start to become familiar with Japanese culture, which they had presumably not had very much access to before that. And we start to see fine and decorative arts that are exchanged. Of particular interest is the Japanese woodblock prints that were developed outside of the history of Western art and therefore don't follow the compositional rules of Western art. So, we've had this history of Western art from Greece and Rome, down through the Renaissance and everything like that, that there's this long history of how to create perspective. There's this long history of how to create figures that the Japanese, because there wasn't a lot of contact, don't really have, right? And yet their images have a lot of formal power, right, despite being outside of this tradition. And this really impressed the Impressionists, right, that they're not presenting this window so much as kind of playing with these sort of formal qualities. And some of the characteristics are a sense of flattened, sort of unmodulated color, and a kind of skewed perspective, right, tilted or flattened perspectives. That become really influential in some Impressionist and sort of moving forward lots of other movements of modern art. So one of those paintings that clearly is playing with some of these ideas is Edgar Degas' The Tub. And again, this is one of a series. This is painted in 1886 with pastel, right, sort of dry sticks of powdered pigment that he draws directly on the surface with, right? So, you can kind of see the hatch marks or the use of the pastel here. It's a little bit more linear. But if we look at this painting carefully, we can see that the angles of perspective are off, right? So presumably we're standing kind of above this woman, watching her bathe in this tub, kind of from above, right? Or sort of, yeah. But if we look at the shelf, right, it's sort of like, okay, the shelf is kind of near her and we're sort of looking down on it. But if we look at the things on the shelf, they're not presented as if we're looking down on them. They're presented as if we're looking straight at them, right? So like the jugs here. And that means if you look at it carefully that they shouldn't be able to sit properly on that shelf, which is tilted up. They look like they should just fall right off, right? That they should just slide down and crash at the bottom of the painting. And so it's this play of perspectives, right, that is taken from Japanese woodblock prints and that Degas uses to create a sense, again, of this kind of modernism, right? And it's seen as modernist because it's sort of acknowledging the surface of the canvas, right? Because that shelf kind of takes up that whole right side. It becomes very two-dimensional, right? And this juxtaposition of a very two-dimensional shelf with these three-dimensional objects sitting on it kind of highlights the very problem of a two-dimensional surface of a painting and a three-dimensional image. Yeah? So he's kind of calling attention to the facts of painting and the illusion of painting. Now, again, this is part of a series. I just brought in a bunch for you. And Degas has been somewhat criticized for being misogynistic, right? That he's making his models hold these very painful and often humiliating poses, and again, presenting them with a sense of the artist and viewer being a kind of voyeur, right? A person who kind of enjoys secretly watching others, often, in terms of them being naked or if they're engaged in sexual activity. That's kind of the more technical definition. But the sense of looking at people who don't know that you're looking at them and sort of gathering pleasure from that is this kind of vision that often is replicated in Impressionist paintings. We can contrast that with a work by a woman, a female impressionist named Mary Cassatt, right? She's born to wealthy parents in Pittsburgh. She's actually an American expatriate living in Paris. She does receive formal training at the Philadelphia Academy of Art and then in private studios in Europe. She settles down in Paris in the 1870s. And Degas sees her works in the Salon of 1874 and invites her to exhibit with the Impressionists at their own exhibition. What's kind of significant about Cassatt too is that she is responsible for the enthusiastic acquisition of Impressionist paintings by wealthy American collectors, right? Because she's from that world. She's from sort of the wealthy American world. And she sort of says, hey, why don't you buy some of these works by my friends? They're really good. And so she's one of the, part of the reason why American art museums have, a larger collection of Impressionist paintings than one might imagine. But being a wealthy woman, right, in Paris, meant that she cannot go to, the bars and clubs, right? She cannot get prostitutes to model for her, right? That basically that world is closed to her as a woman of respectable sort of wealthy status. And so what she tends to paint instead is her own world, right? The world of women and children, of cultivated, well-bred, upper-class family members and friends. And to some degree, because she's so tied with this sense of, motherhood and, painting women and children, she was not for a long time seen as quote unquote modern, right? Even though if we look at her painting, we see a lot of the same formal boldness as her contemporaries, right? Like Degas. So let's look at that. So if we look at the Degas painting, we look at the Cassatt, we see that in terms of formal qualities, right, of the composition, she also has this very sort of tilted perspective. We can see that especially in that picture that's in the lower right-hand corner that also appears like it's not quite painted in the right perspective and that it could just fall down at any second. That's very similar to the Degas, right? And yet she's was seen for a long time as not being modern because she didn't paint with the kind of vision that suggests the sort of sexualized voyeur, right? Or the sexualized gaze of the male viewer to a female nude. That wasn't her MO, and so that, was seen as being not modern. This is kind of ironic because, even though she's associated with sort of mother images, right? She herself was unmarried, childless, independent, successful artist. And that, she's in fact kind of just painting her family and friends, right, with their kids. They're not her kids. I brought in this painting, which is not in the book, but which I think really captures to a large degree the issues for Cassatt and for many women artists of this period, right? So this is Woman in Black at the Opera, also known as In the Loge. Loge is like a theater box. And she paints in this image almost like what it's like to be a woman artist, right? Particularly in terms of the gaze. So here we see her at the opera, right? And she is, in her sort of opera outfit, black outfit, and she is actively looking, right? We see her with her opera glasses looking out, presumably at the stage, right? So as an artist, she is given that sense of subjectivity, right? Of doing the action of looking as an artist. But if we follow her gaze across the across the painting, we come across this man who is practically falling out of his box, looking at her. Yeah, and so she acknowledges in some ways that as a woman, she is also the object of the gaze, right? So as a woman artist, she kind of stands in both places, right? She, as an artist, she is the subject of the gaze, but as a woman, she is the object. So let's look at that, right? Again, right, the subject does the action to the verb. And here we see at the bottom, Cassatt as an artist is doing the action of looking and representing and painting. But as a woman, she acknowledges that in society, she's typically the receiver of that gaze, right? She is the sort of paintee, so to speak. We can see this dynamic play out if we compare her painting to one by another Impressionist painter, Renoir, right? So we see here in the Renoir, a male artist painting a very similar scene, right, called The Loge. And we see this woman here who is seated in the box, and her opera glasses are down. She looks at us, sort of acknowledging our gaze, while the male figure in the painting is the one actively using his opera glasses to look, right, and is not really acknowledging that he's being looked at in this way. If we compare that to the Cassatt, again, we see that she's acknowledging sort of both positions as a woman and as an artist. Another way that she kind of deals with that is also with the viewer, right? So in Renoir's, the viewer here is seen as separate from the space, right? We see the balcony kind of cut off the viewer from the woman so that she is the other here. In the Cassatt painting, however, the way that the balcony or the balustrade here curves means that if we sort of acknowledge how the painting spaces works, we are in the box with her, right? That there's no other way for us, there's no other space for us to be. So that rather than looking at her really, as purely the subject, right, we also experience what she's experiencing, which is that the viewer, that the man who's looking in her direction also looks at us. Right? And so by creating the space of the painting to include us, we get a sense of also having that dual role as being both the subject, the viewer of the painting, but also the object, the one being looked at. And in this way, she does this really amazing job, I love this painting, of kind of showing the difficulties of being a woman artist, right, in this era, right? And again, she's painting herself at the opera, at one of the very few spaces where she's allowed to be. Okay, so let's talk about the Impressionists proper. In 1874, a group of artists who had consistently been rejected by the academic salon, right, again, the one and only exhibition venue in Paris, decide to organize an almost unprecedented exhibition of their own work in a very important and radical gesture of independence, right? So they're basically like, well, forget the whole salon thing. We're going to put on our own exhibition. And this was seen as this kind of almost revolutionary act, right? Because it had very rarely been done before, right? That seems so normal to us now because that's how it works, but at that time it was seen as really, going against the man, so to speak, right? In terms of the salon system. And they didn't just have one, right? They continued it about once a year for almost 12 years, right? So it sort of keeps going, and they basically almost single-handedly kind of break apart the salon system, so that by the end of the century, the whole salon system is no longer even relevant, right? That it's these independent exhibitions that become really where art is. And so they're one of the kind of they're at the forefront of that sense. Now, the press treated this as a joke, right? Because again, this is kind of unprecedented, crazy idea to have artists put on their own exhibition. And a review by this kind of hostile critic named Louis Leroy derogatorily coined the term impressionist to describe their work. And he means it as an insult, referring to what he thought of as this very unfinished, haphazard, sloppily painted character of the works, that they're mere impressions as opposed to competent, carefully composed, and finished works of art that would stand the test of time, right? And so he means it as this really sort of negative thing. And yet the things that Leroy is criticizing were part of the calculated conception of painting advanced by the Impressionists, right? They stress the direct representation of nature. They are famous for painting outdoors in direct sunlight, what we call en plein air, rather than in the studio, right? And they paint quickly in order to capture the momentary effects of light and shadow at specific times of day, right? And the ability to actually go out and paint in nature is new. It's made possible by new technologies in paint and paint tubes, right? So rather than mixing powdered pigments in the studio, right, with oil or egg yolk or, however we saw it before, it's at this moment in time that they develop paint that is pre-mixed and that can go in tubes that you can carry with you outside, and that kind of releases artists from the studio. One of the things that they're trying to do is sort of capture the transitory nature of visual reality, right? That basically objects seen under different conditions change in appearance based on changes in light and atmosphere. And so therefore they often work in series, right? That they paint the same thing over and over again in sort of different lighting effects. They often also look to sort of scientific color theories, right? One of which is to suggest that shadows are not actually black, right? That outlines and black shadows don't exist in nature, but that shadows are in fact sort of blue or purple, depending on the quality of light. Another theory suggests that sort of unmixed colors placed next to each other would mix in the viewer's eyes and create the effect of more brilliant, vibrating color, right? Sort of what we call optical mixing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with post-impressionism. Again, they're trying to capture the sense of modernity in their subject matter, right, by painting the world around them, but also in the kind of visual experience of a glance, right, the sort of transitory moment that we've been talking about. And their argument is that a sketch, right, rather than this finished painting, is a kind of vision like a glance, and that it's equally representative of how vision works, right? Unlike the realists, they tend not to work on a huge scale, but on a more modest scale, right? Sort of smaller paintings, typically. Not tiny, but, normal size. One of the first paintings to be exhibited in this 1874 exhibition is by Claude Monet, and it's called Impression Sunrise. And to some degree, this is where Leroy gets his term, impression. We see here, again, a painting that is very loosely painted, right? There is very little sense of finish or, sort of a clear, crystal clear vision, right? Again, it's this kind of glance vision. And that comes to some degree from how Monet sort of approached his painting, right? And he talks about this and he says, when you go out to paint, try to forget what objects you have before you, a tree, a house, a field, or whatever, and merely think, here is a little square of blue, here is an oblong of pink, here a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape, until it gives you your own naive impression of the scene before you. And he was trying to, get to this kind of sensory information that's registered on the retina of the eye prior to any kind of cognition, right? So rather than painting what a boat or whatever, water or sky to look like, you're painting actually what you see, but sort of deconstructed in that way. So here we have this rapidly painted study of this early morning sun glowing orange through this bluish fog that shrouds the vague forms of masts and cranes and factory chimneys that line the water on this harbor, right? And you can kind of just barely make them out in the background. Again, the title suggests that it isn't meant to be a description of the harbor or a recording of the harbor, that it's meant to be a recording of this momentary visual sensation, right, produced by the sun rising through the mist. And that you need to paint quickly, really, to capture that moment, because there's only so long that the sun will stand still for, right? And so we see here very visible brushstrokes. If we look closer, right, at the sun, especially reflecting off the water, we can see that it's literally just made up of single brushstrokes. That there's no attempt here to blend paint to create smooth tonal gradations. And again, it's seen as modernist because by leaving these brushworks as brushstrokes, he is acknowledging the fact that this is a painting and acknowledging the surface of the canvas while he's kind of capturing this fleeting moment, painting outside on plein air, and showing this kind of life around him, right? The sort of industrial harbor background. Again, experimenting with these color theories, right? We don't see really black shadows or harsh outlines. Forms basically are dissolved in the mist presented here. The sense of forms being dissolved, right, by kind of smoke or by sort of atmospheric effects, but also by the sense of the glance, we really see in his Gare Saint-Lazare, or the Saint-Lazare train station. So over the course of the winter of 1877, he paints this series of views of this railway station, right? And he captures this huge, enclosure with this glass roof. Again, this kind of architecture that doesn't conceal, it's, iron and glass that we talked about before. And railways had been seen as this kind of ugly intrusion into the city, but Monet paints them as the sign of modernity, right, of everyday life. And he did different versions that he paints show different times of day and different angles. Here we see what is probably kind of like noon sunlight, right? And he's trying to capture the energy and vitality of the city, right? We see the tall buildings through the haze. We see the train station as this hub of bustling, people moving around, right? Trains coming in and out, right? And this short, choppy brushwork that he uses gives that sense of energy, right? It's almost like shimmering with energy. We see this play of light and shadow, this sort of dissolving of forms through the haze and the smoke. And again, the sense of the glance, right? Because if you glance around a train station, it's not like you can see every single person's facial features or every single detail, right? Because that's not how vision works. And so that's the kind of vision, right? What you see is this kind of blurry forms. That's the kind of vision that he's trying to capture here. And again, all of this wrapped up in this idea of what modern life is and what modern vision is to some degree. Here you can see just a couple of the other the other paintings in this series. Just brought them in to show you again different times of day, cloudy days, in the evening, etc. And he's famous for painting these series, right? Other ones that he does are the haystacks or the water lilies. And here is a series of Rouen Cathedral, right, sort of north of Paris. And he did something like 40 views of Rouen Cathedral at different times of day, different climatic conditions. And the one in your book is The Portal in Sun from 1894. And I brought in a couple of other ones for you so you can see, right, different times of day, different sort of lighting conditions. Here we see this, the portal in sun, this bright light that almost dematerializes the surface of the facade, right? And so I brought in this photograph so you can see what the cathedral actually looks like, and how much he's kind of trying to show how the light kind of takes away detail, right? That it kind of dematerializes it and makes it sort of shimmery in that way. And so, of course, the critics accuse the Impressionists of destroying form and order for these transitory effects. But that's kind of what they were trying to accomplish, was to show this sense of vision. Finally, I brought in this other painting by Renoir. This is Le Moulin de la Galette, and it's from 1876. Again, sort of a 4x6-ish canvas. And another major interest of the Impressionists was the leisure activity of Paris. As a result of the gentrification of the city that we talked about, there's more sort of middle and upper class leisure seen downtown. That's also, to some degree, part of the industrialization, right, of the city, this opening up of leisure time. So we see these scenes of dining and dancing and cafes, this sort of urban recreation. And so what Renoir is depicting is people gathered at this outdoor Parisian dance hall. But again, this is a dance hall where bourgeois men would consort with proletariat women, right? It is not a meeting of social equals. It is not wealthy upper class women who are frequenting these things. They would not be permitted, right? So it's bourgeois men hanging out with working class women. So, but they're dancing, they're sitting and eating, enjoying the outdoors, and they're dappled with sunlight and shade, right? So if we look at their outfits, if we look at this guy here in the foreground, we understand that his coat is in fact straight black, right? It's not actually polka dot. That the dots on his coat are actually the light filtering through leaves of the trees, right? Because this is sort of outdoor. And so by giving this sense of light filtering through, he really sort of enlivens the scene, right? We also feel like we're there kind of participating in the scene because it's has that sense of spontaneity, right? Of the unposed figures, of the cut-off framing, that he's trying to depict this momentary passing aspects of modernity, this fleeting moment, as somehow more real than timeless and universal art. And he's articulating that he's trying to do this, right? He says, quote, "The work of art must seize upon you, wrap you up in itself, carry you away. It is the means by which the artist conveys his passions. I want people to feel that neither the setting nor the figures are dull and lifeless." Right? And so what he's saying is that you're meant to feel like you're part of the scene, right? That you're kind of involved in it. And that it shouldn't be dull or lifeless, right? That it should be lively, that it should be, give the sense of movement and energy that life is, right? And so I think this painting kind of shows this confluence of the ideas of the Impressionists in terms of the kind of vision that they're trying to create, but also that they're capturing these sort of social conditions that are perhaps on the seedy side. Yeah? All right, so that's all for today.